Masechet Baba Batra Daf Gimel. Yesterday we saw the Mishnah that says Hashutafin sherasu la'asot mechitza bechaser bonim dat hakotel ba'emsa. If partners want to make a mechitza in their courtyard. What does the word mechitza mean? In yesterday's Gemara we started off with the hypothesis that mechitza means a wall, a physical wall, and then we said maybe not, maybe it means that they want to divide, and then we concluded no, it really does mean a physical wall. Now we're going to have a sugya that starts off with the opposite assumption and has some of the same sources that we already saw yesterday. Lishana acharina amrila sebaruha mai mechisa pelukta dichtivati mechisa ta'eda. So another version that first the rabbis that study this Mishnah says, what does the word mechitza mean? It means to make a division, not a physical wall, just to put a line in chalk and to say, this is going to be my side, that's your side. Originally they had one shared courtyard and they both used the entire thing. And then they decided, Datsu, right, they agreed, they say, you know what, we both agree that we want to use it separately. I'll take the west, you take the east. So that's what the word mechitza means. How do we know that the word mechitza does have that meaning? Well, it comes from Sefer Bemidbar, where they divide the spoils, and it says mechitza ta'eda, the division of the congregation. That's not a physical wall, it's dividing something. This is your part, this is my part. Now, so in that case, what does this Mishnah teach? So they can't force each other to divide the land, but if they both agree to divide the land, you have west, I have east, then the next step, they can force each other to build a wall. So once you say, okay, you're agreeing to divide the land? Yeah, I agree. All right, now you know what? I want a wall because I don't want you peering in to my side of the courtyard. I want my privacy. And one can force the other to build a wall. We learn from there that a gaze is called damage. I don't want you gazing into my property. I can force you to build a wall, and you have to share the space of the wall and the cost of the bricks. מהי מחיסה גודה דתנן מחיסת הכרם שנפרסה אומר לו גדור נפרסה אומר לו גדור נתייש ממנה לו ולא גדרה הרי זה קידש וחיה באחריותה. Now we challenge this definition of mechitza that means a division, and we say no, maybe it actually means a wall, a physical wall, guda, and we see that is definitely the meaning in the following baraita. If you have a division, a wall, between a vineyard and a wheat field, and it falls down, the owner of the wheat field can tell the owner of the vineyard, make a new partition, because otherwise your vines are going to grow into my wheat field and cause kilayim, and then everything will be prohibited. And the owner of the vineyard has to do so because his vines are the ones that are growing and would encroach on the other person's field. And now let's say he fixes it and it breaks again. So again, the owner of the wheat field can tell him, build a partition. As long as you have a partition, then that keeps them separate. It's permitted. Now, if the owner of the vineyard gets lazy and neglects to rebuild that wall, so then once the vineyard vines grow a significant amount, then they both become prohibited and the owner of the vineyard has to pay damages to the owner of the wheat field. The point of this entire Mishnah is that surely it means a physical division. It means a wall. So you see the word mechitza does mean a wall here. And now what would be the legal conclusion if we apply that to our Mishnah also? Ta'amad derasu, halo rasu, and mechayvin oto al ma'ezek reya, lav shemehezek. So then it would mean partners that want to make a wall, then they have to build it in this way. That means only if they both agree to build a wall, then they have to build it according to the regional custom. But if one of them does not want to build a wall, then he could say, no, I don't want to build a wall. You want a wall, you can put it on your land and you pay for it, but you can't force me to. So the conclusion of that, in that case, is that gaze is not considered damage, right? Because if it was damage, hey, if you're causing me damage, I can force you to stop and you have to pay for the wall. But if it's not called damage, then I cannot force you to build a wall. So that will come to the opposite conclusion. Now, ihachi bonin et hakota bonin otomi ba'ele. Okay, so now, right now we're thinking that the word mechitza means a wall, but if so, it doesn't read smoothly in the Mishnah, because it shouldn't say bonin et hakotel to say a noun again. It should have used a pronoun. If partners that want to make a mechitza bechatzer, bonin oto, you already mentioned the word mechitza, which means a kotel, so you would say bonin oto, and not say the word again, the noun again, and even a different word, bonin et hakotel. It doesn't read smoothly. But it reads smoothly if you say that if the partners want to make a division, then they build a wall. That's fine. Okay, so that now we challenge the wall hypothesis. Elamai pelukta iachi sherasu lasod mechisa sherasu lachasot meba'ele. So now what do you want to tell me? That it means a division? If so, that also doesn't read smoothly, because it should say if partners that want to divide, it should use a verb rather than a noun that want to make a division. If you say make a division, it sounds like you're building something, you're building a wall. If you want to just divide something, then you should use a verb. And we answer that, actually, there's a folk saying that people will say, let's make a division. That's a normal way to say that we're dividing something, and even though you're using a noun to make a division, so you know what, the Mishnah actually reads fine, it reads smoothly, with the assumption that mechitza means a division. Fine. Now, now the conclusion of that, if it means division, then in fact, one person can, once they agree to divide, one person can force the other to build a wall. So now we ask, why does it say if they want to? Even if they don't want to, hey, this hezek, you're gazing into my property, so I should be able to force you to build a wall. Amar Rabbi Aseh, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishnatenu keshe'en ba din haluka, vehu derasu. Rabbi Aseh, and then Rabbi Yochanan explains, our Mishnah is talking about a courtyard that is smaller than 8 amot wide. You see, if it's 8 amot wide or bigger, then either side can say, listen, I know we're sharing the courtyard now, but I want to have my own section of a courtyard, and I'm forcing you to you use the east, I'll use the west. And then once they divide, since hezek riyah is hezek, I also force you to build a wall. That would be true, but that's not what our Mishnah is talking about, right? That's what we thought at first. Why does it say ratzu? It said if it's a large area, then I can force you to divide and I can force you to build a wall. Rather, Rabbi Yochanan explains, our Mishnah is talking about a smaller full courtyard that's less than 8 amot in length. In that case, if we divide it, then let's say it's 7, then I'm going to have 3.5 and you have 3.5. 3.5 is not a significant amount it's barely usable. So you cannot force me to divide the land that's less than 8. That's what it's talking about. In that case, you can't force me. But if we both agree, you know what, I'm okay with having 3.5 and you have 3.5, fine, I'll use it some way. Once we agree to divide it, then I can force you to build a wall, or you can force me to build a wall. That's what it's talking about. So it reads like this: Hashutafin sha'asu lasot mechitza bechaser. If you have a small courtyard and they both agree to divide it, and each side will only be 3, then bonin et hakotel ba'emsa. One can force the other to build a wall in the middle. They can force each other because gaze is called damage. All right. Now that works. Now if that's how you read the Mishnah, so what is the Mishnah coming to teach us? The chidush is that even though, if in a case where it's smaller than 8, if they agree, they can divide it. Is that what it's coming to teach us? We already know that from a Mishnah later on Daf Yod Aleph. מתי בזמן שאין שניהם רוצים, אבל בזמן ששניהם רוצים, אפילו פחות מכאן חולקין. The Mishnah there says, when do they not divide a courtyard because it's too small? Only if they both don't want to. But if they both want to, right, if they agree to, then even less than 8, they can divide it. So we already know it from that Mishnah. We answer, no, if I only had that Mishnah later on, I might have thought that when it says that if they agree, they divide it, then that that it's sufficient to put up a very small partition, a very thin partition just made out of pegs that would not prevent privacy problems. I might have thought that. And so I need this Mishnah to say, not only are they permitted to divide it, and that they have to make some kind of partition, they have to make, in fact, a nice big wall according to the custom of the place, in order that one should not be able to see into the other, because a gaze is considered damaged. That's what our Mishnah is teaching. If so, why not just teach our Mishnah here on Daf Bet? Because this already teaches us all the information we need, and we don't need the Mishnah later on. That one is redundant. It's not even as clear as our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says you need a real wall. Over there it doesn't say that. And the answer is Sefa is Terichaleh uvechitbeh hakodesh af al pi sheshenem rosim lo yachaloku. We only need that Mishnah for the continuation of that Mishnah, that's where the chidush is. The beginning of the Mishnah is only there to just repeat what we already know here, so that it can add this extra law. The extra law there is that if we jointly own a sacred scroll, right? We jointly own a Sefer Yeshaya, say. Even though we both agree, you know what, we want to split it. I'll take the first half, you take the second half. It's not even though we both agree, it's not permitted to do so, because it's not respectful to tear a scroll in half. You have to have a whole scroll. It's a problem to have only half a scroll. Then, you're missing half the story. You don't have the entire context. And therefore, you are not allowed to divide, cut a scroll in two. You can sell it and then divide the proceeds, but you can't divide the actual thing. That's the chidush of that later Mishnah. The beginning of the Mishnah, you're right, we already know from here. Now, we have in parentheses another lishana acharina. This is yet another version of some of the material that we just spoke about before. If we look at manuscripts, you'll see that this lishana acharina, it starts here, it goes about 2 paragraphs until this word yachaloku. It is found in the Vilna Shas in parentheses. It's also found in the first printings in Venice and Pizarro. Venice by Bamberg, Pizarro by Sansino. And there it appears without parentheses. It just reads on in it. It doesn't even say Lishana Charina, it just says V'chiratzu and so on. However, these 2 paragraphs, you can see, are not found in any manuscript except for one. It's also not in the 2 Geniza fragments that are presented here. And so you see that this seems to be yet another version of another version that was preserved only in this one Vatican manuscript. So it's likely not part of the original Talmud. We will learn it, but I want to skip it for now and then come back to it, because it actually reads more smoothly if we go directly from here to the next part, and then I'll go back to the parentheses. B'may okimta lematnitin b'she'en ba'adin chaluka. I b'she'en ba'adin chaluka ki rasu may haveh nehedru behu. Now, how have we so far interpreted our Mishnah? We're talking about a small courtyard where one cannot force the other to divide, because it's less than 8 amot altogether. If so, that it's small, then if they both want to, so what? Why would one then be able to make the other one build a wall? Let him change his mind. In other words, we have a courtyard that's 7 amot long, and we're sharing it, we're using it together. You ask me, and you say, hey, would you mind? I want to make a division. I'll use the west side, you use the east side. We'll put a chalk down the middle. I say, okay, fine. I don't mind. I agree to that. And then an hour later, you say, listen, you have to make a wall now, because I don't want you peering into my side. So I said, well, I don't want to pay for a wall. Forget it. I take back what I said about dividing it. You know what? I'm not going to divide it. So how can you force me to build a wall? I could just go back on my statement that I said that I want to divide it. Forget it. I don't want to divide it. And now you cannot force me to build a wall. So what would be a case where you could force me to build a wall when it's smaller than 8? And the answer is Amar Rabbi Aseh Amar Rabbi Yochanan Shekanu miyadan. It's where we made a kinyan. You came and said, you want to divide it? I said, fine, let's divide it. And we did something to make that acquisition official. Now I can't renege on that deal. Once that deal is in place, then you can come and say, gaze is damage, and you're damaging me by invading my privacy. You have to pay for half a wall, then I would have to pay for half the wall. Now, what kind of acquisition would that be? Wait a second, even if I agreed to it and we made an acquisition, what kind of acquisition are you talking about? A verbal acquisition that I said, yes, I'm okay? That's not official. I can renege on a verbal acquisition. And the answer to that is Bishekanu miyadan beduhot. No, we did something official. We did an action where that made it clear that I'm going to take the west, you're going to take the east. For example, Rav Ashi Amar, kegon shalach zeh betoch shelo vechezik vezeh betoch shelo vechezik. One of the partners walked around in his area to say, this is my area, and the other also walked around the other side of it to show that that's his area. That's one of the ways of acquiring land, is to walk its breadth and its length, as we see by Abraham. Hashem says, everywhere you walk, that will be yours. And so that was always a way of acquiring something. So since we did an action to divide it, that means that's it. Neither of us can renege on the division. Once a division is in place, now one can force the other to also build a wall, because according to this sugya, this version of the sugya, hezek re'iyah is in fact hezek. Okay, now we just go back and learn this lishana acharina. Lishana acharina v'chi ratzu mai haveh lihadar be. It's a similar question to what we just had. Even if we agree to divide, so what? We can just renege on the deal. Amar Rav Aseh Amar Rabbi Yochanan b'shekanu miyado v'chule. Oh, we're talking about where we made an acquisition, a division. So you see that this is following what we just read later on. Therefore, this insertion really should be down below a little an extra paragraph. It makes sense to read it afterwards. Okay, now in this version, it's going to be the same. We're going to come to the same conclusion. It just adds an extra step of clarification. If once you're saying that our Mishnah is talking about a small courtyard that one cannot force the other to be divided because it's less than 8. So why does it teach us that? Why not teach us the same lesson in a large courtyard and teach the opposite, even though they both don't agree? If it's bigger than 8, then I can force you to divide, right? I have 4 and you have 4, and hezek re'iyah, and that you have to build a wall, right? In other words, if the point of this Mishnah is to say one person can force each other to build a wall, why bother using a more unusual case of where it's small, and okay, you agreed to divide it, and now once you agreed to divide it, now I force you to build a wall? Wouldn't it be easier to use a normal case of it's bigger than 8, I can force you to divide it, and then I can also force you to build a wall. Yesh minan b'yesh badin haluka, af agav de lo rasu, hava mina she'en badin haluka, afilu rasu namila, kamashmalan. The answer is, if our Mishnah only said a case of where it's bigger than 8, and I can force you to divide it, and I can force you to build a wall, then I would have thought that if it's a smaller courtyard where I cannot force you to divide it, then even if we agree, we cannot divide it. I might have thought that, and that's why the Mishnah has to teach me this. It's good that the Mishnah teaches me this case to know that if we agree and it's less than 8, then we can divide it. Otherwise, I might not know that. Hold on. Could you really explain our Mishnah that way? Vakatani sefa ematai bizman she'en shenehem rosim aval bizman she'nehem rosim yachaloku my love akotel. So no, how could you explain our Mishnah like that? The sefa of the Mishnah on Daf Yud Aleph says that's not true, because it says, when do we say that a small courtyard is not divided? That's only when not both of them want to. But if both of them agree, then they do divide it. Now, when you say they do divide it, doesn't that mean that they also have to build a wall? And so we would know from that Mishnah later on that certainly they have to build a wall, and therefore it would be impossible to interpret our Mishnah otherwise. And we answer la amesefas be'alma. In that Mishnah, I could have interpreted that, if they agree, then they can divide a small courtyard, and they would divide it in that Mishnah only with a thin partition of pegs, not a wall. And that's why this Mishnah is giving us a chidush and saying, you have to divide it with a wall. Litnehai vela litnehai. If so, let them just teach this Mishnah, and I wouldn't need that Mishnah because this Mishnah has all the information that we need. And the answer is Sefa istarich aleh ubichitbeh hakodesh af al pi shenehem rosim lo yachaloku. No, I need that Mishnah later on Daf Yud Aleph, even though the whole beginning is we already know from this Mishnah. I need it for the end of the Mishnah that says if we want to divide a sacred scroll, then even if we both parties agree, you're not allowed to do it because it's not respectful to split one Sefer of Tanakh into two. We now move on to the next part of the Mishnah. This is Makom Shenagu Libnot Vechule, wherever it's customary to build with Gevil, it means non-chiseled, Gazi, chiseled stones, Kifisin, half bricks, Levenim, whole bricks. You have to leave that amount of room on your land. So let's define these terms better. Gevil abne de la mishapeya. Gevil means stones that are not smoothed out, so that they're the biggest because they stick out. Gazit abne de mishapeya. Dichtiv kol ele abanim mikarot ke midot gazit. Gazit means stones that are smoothed out, so they're a little bit smaller. And how do we know that the word gazit means that? From the following pasuk in Sefer Melachim, the proof from the pasuk is actually from the words that are not quoted here. So let's go back and look at the full pasuk. It says, Kol ele abanim yikarot kemidot gazit megorarot b'megera. That all these buildings were made from stones that were hewn, smoothed on all sides. So you see that the word gazit means made smooth all around, and once you smooth them out, then they're going to be a little bit smaller. And kefisin ad orche lebenin libne. Kefisin means small bricks or half bricks, and lebenin means large bricks. אמר לרבה ברד רבה לרב אשר, ממאי דגביל אבני דלה משפיעה נינהו, והי טפח יתרה למורשה דקרנתה. So Rabba, the son of Rava, asked Rav Asher, how do you know about these definitions of the words? How do you know that gevil means something that a stone that is not smoothed down, and that extra tefach, right? We said for gevil you need 3 on both sides, so 6 altogether. That extra tefach is for the protrusions because it's not smoothed out above the gazit, which is 2.5 on each side, was only 5. Right? How do you know that the extra tefach you need for gevil is because the edges are not smooth and they're all jagged and sticking out? Dilma palga de gazitu v'hai tefach yitera lebene urbehu. Maybe gevil means hewn stones, smooth stones, that are really only 2.5 each, but the reason you might need an extra tefach is because you make 2 rows and you fill in the middle with other material, which makes it something very strong. That is the definition for the bricks and the half bricks. So this is one of the building methods, is to put a row of bricks here, a row of bricks here, and leave a tefach in the middle and fill it in with gravel or mortar, and that would make it very strong. Maybe that is the difference between gevil and gazit, but in fact they're both talking about the same smoothed out stones. Kedekamrinan, And that would make sense because then it would be parallel to what we say for the next two definitions. Kifisin are half bricks and lebenin are whole bricks. And the reason why for kifisin you need an extra tefach more than lebenin is because you need one tefach to fill inside. Maybe that's the same thing as the difference between the first two. And so Rav Asher answered, how do you even know what kifisin are, that those mean small bricks, half bricks? These definitions are from tradition. So just like kifisin, we only know what that is from tradition, so to gevil, we know from tradition that means a non-smoothed brick. And that's why it's so big, because of the jagged edges. That's all one version of that discussion. The other version just is the same, just starting from the other end. So in this version, Rav Acha asked Rav Asher, how do you know that kifisin means half bricks, and the extra tefach you need for kifisin over livenim is because you make two walls and you put mortar or gravel in between. Dilma my kifisin abne de la mishapian v'hetefach yitera l'musha de karneta kedekamrinan gevil abne de la mishapian gazit abne de mishapian v'hetefach yitera l'musha de karneta. Maybe the word kifisin means stones that are jagged, and the extra tefach you need more for kifisin more than levenim is because of the jagged edges that stick out. As we say for gevil, that is stones that are not smoothed out, and gazit means they're smooth, and the extra tefach is for jagged edges. So maybe the third and fourth terms in the Mishnah are the same as the first two terms, meaning they're both the differences between them are the same, that you need the extra tefach for filling in the space in between. And Rav Asher answered, how do you know that gevil in the first half means jagged stones? That's based on a tradition. In fact, definitions of all words. How would anybody know any words what they mean? All of language is based on an oral tradition, and these specific technical terms are also based on legal traditions of what they mean, and therefore, just like for gevil you have an oral tradition, so too for kifisin we know from tradition that it means a half brick. Abayah says we can learn from this Mishnah that anytime you have you're filling in, you're making a wall with two sides and you're filling in the middle, that the fill in the middle is one tefach thick. However, that's only if you're filling it in with mortar. But if you're filling it in with gravel, then the gravel is actually going to need more space. That's one version. Others say that when Abaye said this regarding a tefach, that's only when it's gravel you need a tefach. But if it's mortar, then you would need even less. So this Ikada Amre is the opposite of the previous one. For some reason, these opening sugyot have a lot of different versions. Sometimes the versions are the same, and sometimes the versions are the opposite. Next, we're going to learn about some engineering. What is the ratio between the height and thickness of a wall in order for it to be sturdy? Lememra de begazit dechol 4 amot gova, I have putya 5 ka'eh, ila la ka'eh. When we talk about building a wall in the Mishnah, we're talking about that it should be 4 amot high, about 6 feet high, and that way it won't be easy to peer over. That's high enough that it will stop a gaze. Now, let's pick gazit. If it's hewn stones, then if it's 4 amot high, it needs to be 5 tefachim thick in order for it to stand. And if it's less thick than that, then it will be too flimsy and it will not stand. Hold on, but in the Bet HaMikdash, we're talking about in the first Bet HaMikdash, where you had an amat raksin. This is a wall in the Hechal separating the Kodesh Kodashim to the Kodesh. In the second Bet HaMikdash there were curtains because it was much higher and they couldn't build such a high wall. But in the first Bet HaMikdash there was a brick wall in between with a door so that the Kohen Gadol could go into the Kodesh Kodashim on Yom Kippur. Now, that wall was 1 amah thick. That's 6 tefachim, thicker than the 5 tefachim that we just spoke about. But that one was 30 amot high. That's how high the Hechal was in the first Bet HaMikdash. And it was only 6 tefachim wide, and yet it stood. So how could it be, right? I mean, if you just do the math and assume the ratios are the same, then 4 amot high, you need 5 tefachim. So 30 amot high, you'd need a much thicker wall. How could it stand? And the answer is, Kevan de'ika tefach yetera ka'eh. No, since it has 1 extra tefach, it can stand even 30 amot high. It's an exponential growth. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio. And even although 5 tefachim thick can hold up 4 amot, 1 extra tefach of thickness can hold up much more, even up to 30 amot high. Ubamikdash sheni maita ma'ala abud amma teraksin. How come in the second Bet HaMikdash they also didn't make a wall that was an amma thick, just like in the first Bet HaMikdash? Ki ka'eh betelatin ka'eh tefer la ka'eh. Because a wall that's 6 tefachim thick can stand 30 amot high, but not higher than that, and the second Bet HaMikdash was much higher. Second Bet HaMikdash, we know, was actually revamped and rebuilt a number of times, and the one that we're familiar with is Herod's temple, which we'll talk about in a minute. And so at different times, the second Bet HaMikdash actually might have been different heights. Right when they first built it, it sounds like it was not such an impressive building, because in Sefer Ezra it says the elders who remembered the first Bet HaMikdash were actually crying when they saw the second Bet HaMikdash built, because it was not as glamorous as the first. But eventually they made it nicer, and so eventually it was higher. And by the end, the Herodian second Bet HaMikdash was even higher than 30, and a wall of 1 amah wide would not be able to hold up such height. Okay. Uminelan tehava gavoa tefer. Now, how do you know that the second Bet HaMikdash was even higher than the first? Tichtib gadol yeh kevod habayit hazeh acharon min harishon. Because Haggai, who was one of the Nevi'im, who was around encouraging Bnei Israel to build the second Bet HaMikdash, says that greater will the honor of the second Bet HaMikdash be over the first. Rav Ushmuel v'amri ra Rabbi Yochanan v'Rabbi Elazar chad amar b'minyan. Now, in what way is this glory going to be greater? Rav and Shmuel had 2 opinions, and some say Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar had a dispute about this. One of the opinions said it's the structure that's going to be taller than the first. V'chad amar b'shanim, and the other opinion said it's going to last longer in years. In fact, the first Bet HaMikdash was up for 410 years, and the second Bet HaMikdash, according to historical numbers, was up for 586 years. V'italeha, v'italeha. And in fact, they're both true. The second Bet HaMikdash, eventually, for sure the Herodian one, was bigger in size and was up for longer. V'ni'abdu telatin amin bebinyan v'idach ne'abid parochet. Now I have a question. In the second Bet HaMikdash, how come they made the whole thing a curtain? I know you said that you can't make a wall that's high. How high was it? This Mishnah says 100 amot high, but it might be a typo for mem, meaning in the Mishnah, meaning mem 40, that was expanded to me'af. So either 40 or 100. Either way, why didn't you make a wall that was 30 amot high? You said that it can that if it's 1 tefach, 1 amah thick, then it can be 30 amot high, and then that's as high as you can go. And so the bottom half, or the bottom part will be a wall, and then above that make a curtain. Ki ka'eh telatina ma'ata nameh agav tikra ma'ziba hava ka'eh v'la tikra ma'ziba la hava ka'eh. Because when we say that you can build a wall that's 30 amot high when it's 1 amah thick, that's only when you have the ceiling and plaster. You put plaster on top and attach it to the ceiling, so the roof actually will hold the wall and make it more stable. But without plaster and a ceiling, then it would not be able to stand even 30 amot. Okay, fine. Even if it's not 30 high, do it as high as you can. Since it's 5 tefachim, you can make it 4 amot high. 6 tefachim, you can make it higher. How high? Whatever it is. Make it that high, 10, 15 amot high. And then the rest make a curtain. Why not make a wall as much as you can? Amar Abaye gemiri equal lehu bebinyan equal lehu beparochet equal lehu bebinyan b'mikdash equal lehu beparochet mimishkan. Abaye explains, we have a tradition that either you make the entire partition as a wall or you make it entirely as a curtain. If you make it entirely as a wall, that's fine because you learn that from the first Bet HaMikdash. If you want to make the entire thing out of a curtain, that's also fine. We learn that from the Mishkan, where it was only a curtain. That's fine. You can do all one or all the other, but you can make half a brick wall and half of a curtain. Hen vesidan or dilma hen belo sidan. Now back to the Mishnah. When it said the thickness of different building materials is 6 tefachim, 5 tefachim, 4 tefachim, or 3 tefachim, is that together with the plaster? You see, after they made the wall, then they would plaster the sides of it to keep it even stronger and keep the moisture out. So is that thickness with the plaster, or is that without the plaster, and then you have to add a little bit more for the plaster as well? Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, mistabera hen vesidan, disal kadeatech hen belo sidan, litneye leshi'oreh. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says it makes sense that the Mishnah is including the plaster, because if you think that this is just the size of the brick, is 5 tefachim, but without the plaster, then it should say what the measurement is also. Oh, you have this much plus plaster. I mean, after all, we have to know what the amount is, because we said if it falls, then we see how much land did it take on my side and on your side. How much land do you have to give for it? So these are important measurements. So it must be that the measurement includes plaster. Otherwise, if this measurement didn't include plaster, then the Mishnah would have had to tell me separately, oh, and the plaster is this much more. Ela lav shema mina hen vesidan. So that means Mishnah is including the plaster. No, it could be that the size of these bricks is without the plaster, and the reason why the Mishnah doesn't bother to say how much the plaster is because it's less than a tefach. It's a fractional amount, and the Mishnah is not going to bother to tell us about fractional amounts. Hold on, the Mishnah does give us fractional amounts. For example, when it tells us the bricks, which is the smallest, it says one person has to give 1.5 tefachim and the other partner 1.5 tefachim. So you see, it mentions half tefachim, so it should give a fractional amount. If indeed the plaster is not included, then it should say how much it is. And we answer, Hatam hazel astirufe. No, and that over there, it's saying 1.5 because we add them together. So it's making it clear that a full levena is 3 tefachim. But for the plaster, if it just said, oh, and another half for tefach, for the plaster or quarter, whatever it is, it's not adding up to 1. So the Mishnah is not going to bother with giving us fractional amounts, and therefore it could be that the Mishnah is not including plaster in the measurements because it does not want to include fractional amounts. Okay, so we're still not sure. Let's try to bring a proof from the Mishnah in Masechet Eruvin. Tashema korah shamru rechava kedei lekabel ariach v'ariach chasi lebena shel shelosha tefachim. Over there, if you want to join many courtyards together around an alleyway, you have to make a korah. You have to have a cross beam and at the entrance. Now that cross beam, how thick does it have to be? It has to be thick enough that it can hold a small brick, ariach. How small is that brick? Ariach is half of a levena, and a levena is 3 tefachim. So you see, we're not plastering that. It's just, we're just giving a measurement of how thick the beam has to be. We're giving it in terms of a brick, just a plain brick. It's not a brick that's built into a wall with plaster. So we see that a levena is 3 tefachim without plaster. Isn't that a good proof? And we say, no, not necessarily. Hatam berabre bata. That could be talking about a full brick, a large brick. And even when you say levena, there are those that are fully 3 tefachim and those that are a little less. And in fact, it must be that. It must be so from the language of this Mishnah. Tekatani shel shelosha tefachim miklardika zutra shemamina. Why does it have to say a half of a brick of a levena that is 3 tefachim? That means that there are some levenot that are 3 tefachim, and because they're made fully, and some that are a little bit smaller. Maybe they're a little bit smaller because there's gonna be some something that plaster that you put on the side. So there were 2 different size levenim, and that has to teach us that. So therefore, this Mishnah is not a proof that all levena bricks are 3 tefachim fully, and the plaster is added onto it. It could be that our Mishnah here is talking about the smaller size levena bricks, and the plaster then would be included. And so we end without fully answering that question. Since we spoke about the building of the second Bet HaMikdash, we're going to go into a halacha that will be related to that rebuilding by Herod. Amar Rav Chisda, la listor inish bekenishta ad bane bekenishta achariti. Ikadamre mishum peshiuta, ikadamre mishum saluye. Rav Chisda says an important halacha. One is not allowed to demolish one Bet Knesset until you build a new Bet Knesset first. You have to build a new one first. Only then can you demolish the old one. There's 2 opinions about why. The first opinion is because of negligence. If you knock down the old synagogue, then you may not ever rebuild. You might have good intentions, but people might get lazy, they might not raise enough money, they might get to have zoning problems, and therefore then you can have no synagogue left. So you have to make sure the new one comes and only then knock down the first one. The other opinion says, no, it's because in the meantime you won't have a place to pray. We need a Bet Knesset every day. So if you knock it down and then it takes you a year to rebuild, what are you going to do that whole year? My benahi, what will be a practical difference between the 2 different opinions of the reason? Ika benahi dika be kinishta hariti. More zutra satre ubanu be kaita be sitva ubanu be sitva be kaita. The difference would be, let's say there is another Bet Knesset. There's 2 Bate Knessiyot nearby in town. In that case, if the only problem is that there won't be any other place to pray, then as long as there's another Bet Knesset that's in walking distance, so then it's okay. You can knock down a Bet Knesset and rebuild it, and in the meantime, everybody will go to the other Bet Knesset, the one that otherwise we would never go to that Bet Knesset. That's fine. But if the reason is because you may not rebuild it, well, then that would apply even if there isn't another Bet Knesset. It's not okay. You can't knock it down because you might be lazy, negligent, and never rebuild it, so therefore it would not be allowed. Now, Modemod and Morzutra, they apparently followed the second reason of not having another place to pray. And that's why they would demolish the summer synagogue during the winter, and they would rebuild the winter synagogue in the summer. They had 2 different buildings because of the temperature difference. So during the winter, they would use a building that was all sealed up and insulated, and during the summer, they would use a different building that had lots of windows because it got hot. And so, since all winter long they're not using the summer one, so then they could break it down and rebuild it in the meantime. So you see, they're following the opinion that the only problem is that you may have to make sure you have another place to pray. So Ravina asks Rav Asher, according to the first reason that people might be negligent and not rebuild it, what if the money is already collected and in the bank? We already have the full funds to rebuild it. So, that's usually the major obstacle in rebuilding, is that you can't get enough funds. So how about then? Then can we knock it down and rebuild it? And he says, no, because You never know. Maybe in the meantime, someone from the community will be taken captive and we'll have to use that money to redeem captives. Redeeming captives is the most important cause, and you even take money that was donated for a Bet Knesset and you would use it. So then we would redeem the captives, then we wouldn't have enough money to rebuild the Bet Knesset, and then you'd have just an empty lot and no Bet Knesset. So no, that's not good enough. Shirigi libne behadri hudre umachti kashure mai. What if the bricks are all piled up and the boards are prepared and the beams are ready? All the building materials for building the new synagogue are already bought and are on site. Then can we knock down the old structures to put up the new one? Says no, even then it's not permitted, because it could be that someone will be taken captive and we'll have to sell all the building material in order to get money to redeem the captive, and then we won't build the synagogue. So even then, no, you can't knock down the old structure. Well, in that case, there's no end. Even if they built the synagogue, it could be that we'll build the synagogue and then someone will take them captive. We'll have to sell the synagogues to make money. So that would mean that you can never build a new synagogue, because there's always a chance that then you'd have to sell it. Amri amarle dirate dinashe la mizabeni. And so the answer was, no, that's going too far. No, a person does not sell his residence, right? Even if you have an important cause, okay, you raise money, you might sell some items, you sell some jewelry, but you don't sell your house, because where are you going to sleep? You're going to be out in the street. So too, we do not sell an already existing Bet Knesset, not even for Pidyon Shivuyim. This is the synagogue, we already have it. So once it's built, then that's no problem. And so until it's built, you cannot knock down the old one. Once the new one is up, then you can knock down the old structure. However, this halacha, Rav Chisda, is only when there are no cracks in the old building. But if you see that there are cracks in the old building, you see it's starting to fall apart, is actually dangerous, then you may and maybe even must demolish it and build a new one. Ki had Rav Asher haza batiyuha b'chnishta demata machzaya satre ve'ayil lepurye da'atam ve'la apeke ad matkin le shifiche. For example, Rav Asher, he saw that there were cracks in the Bet Knesset in his city of Machsaya. And so they knocked it down. And Rav Asher wanted to really make sure that they would rebuild it. Look, in such a case, you're allowed to knock it down. But Rav Asher was afraid that people would get lazy and not knock it down. So you know what he did? He moved his bed on site, onto the building site, and he did not remove his bed from there until they finished the building. Not only finished the building, but even put the drain pipes in. In other words, he wanted to make sure that the people would rebuild it right as quickly as possible. And therefore he says, listen, I'm sleeping on site this whole time. I'm going to sleep out in the rain if you don't put a roof on it. And so everybody's like, oh, Rav Asher, we have to take care of him and not let him sleep out in the cold, out in the rain. And so that way they hurried up, and he put his personal comfort on the line. Baba ben Buta, hechi asbeh le'esa lehordos lemistere lebet hamikdash. And now we ask about Baba ben Buta, who was one of the greatest sages in the 1st century BCE, and he gave advice to Herod that it's okay for Herod to destroy the Bet HaMikdash that had been there in order that he can rebuild a new Bet HaMikdash, even greater and better than before. Herod started this building project of the second Bet HaMikdash in 20 BCE, and he did in fact make the western wall that we see today is the foundation wall. He redid the entire plaza on top, and in order to make this beautiful grand Bet HaMikdash, he had to demolish the one that was there before. And so Herod asked advice of Baba ben Buta, what should I do? Am I allowed to demolish the previous one in order to make a new one? We're going to see the continuation of this part of the story of how it came to be that Herod asked Baba ben Buta this question. But right now we're asking, how could Baba ben Buta go against the halacha? It says even a synagogue, you're not allowed to demolish it until you build a new one. So how could he tell Herod that he could demolish the Bet HaMikdash even before the new one was built? Maybe he would change his mind and then he would demolish it and then not rebuild it. V'amar Rav Chisda lo listori nish bekenishta ad baneh Bet Knesset Chrita. After all, Rav Chisda says even for Bet Knesset, one cannot destroy it until you build a new one first. And we have a couple of answers. One answer is that the old Bet HaMikdash was already up hundreds of years, and there were cracks in it, and so it was cracking. It was dangerous. It was going to fall down, and that's why he was permitted to demolish it. Amar Malchuta akar ture vela hadar be. Or another answer is that if a government says that they're going to do something, then you can trust it because they're not going to change their mind. After all, or nothing's going to be an obstacle in their way. After all, Shemuel said that if a government says we're going to uproot this mountain, then they'll uproot it and they're not going to change their mind. So this is different if you have a single individual or even a community that says, okay, we have a committee, the building committee, they're going to rebuild the synagogue. Hopefully they will, maybe they won't, maybe they'll get distracted, maybe they'll run out of money, they won't be able to raise the money. And so zoning problems, there's always problems. That's why for regular people, you have to build a new one first and only then demolish. But if the government itself says, and this is Herod, he's the king of the Jews, and if he says he's committed to rebuilding, then he could demolish it because we can be sure that he'll have the funds and the manpower and the ability to rebuild the new one. This story here in the Talmud is actually reflected almost in a very similar way in Josephus. Josephus, by the way, does talk about the height of the second Bet HaMikdash. He does mention 60 cubits over here. But more to this point, King Herod says, went and made a speech to all the people. It says, I'm going to rebuild the second Bet HaMikdash. He thought he's doing them a great favor. And then the people were very afraid that maybe he's going to pull down the current edifice and then he's not going to rebuild it. And so Herod speaks to them and says he would not pull down their temple till all things were gotten ready for the building, for building it up in its entirety again. And he promised them this beforehand so that he did not break his word, and he got everything ready, all there, so that as soon as he started, he was able to demolish the old one and immediately start and rebuild the new one. And you see the people were worried, and having all the building materials prepared was able to calm them down. Baruch Adonai Olam, Amen ve'amen.